Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today. My name is Faheedat Bakare, and I am presenting my systematic review on the impact of childhood emotional abuse on the therapeutic relationship. This study aims to explore how emotional abuse shapes the way people who have experienced it connect with their therapist and the best way to support them. This review aims to this review aims to answer two questions. It aims to answer how childhood emotional abuse can impact therapeutic relationship and how a therapist can best tailor support for individual clients or for clients who have experienced emotional abuse. As emotional abuse often disrupts emotional development and attachment, which could affect healing, childhood emotional abuse survivors people who have experienced childhood emotional abuse might bring mistrust into the therapeutic room, or which could complicate the alliance needed for change. So, this systematic review would be based on three theoretical frameworks: attachment theory, polyvagal and trauma informed care, and relational repair models. Early caregiver bond shapes future relational behavior, and early emotional early exposure to emotional abuse might disrupt the development of secure attachment. And as adults, people who have experienced emotional abuse as a child tend to might carry internal narratives that other people are uninterested in them or are not trustworthy, which makes them create barriers to that might hinder them building rapport with their therapist. And these barriers might manifest as withdrawals, mistrust, or even resistance, not because the client doesn't want help, but because at that point safety doesn't feel familiar for them and they don't feel safe right in that environment. So, for polyvagal theory, childhood emotional abuse might disrupt autonomic nervous system, causing hypervigilance, which might cause mistrust. So, a polyvagal theory adds a physiological lens. It explains why emotional abuse might dysregulate the autonomic nervous system, leaving survivors in leaving people who have experienced it in constant flight or fight mode, or even just emotional shutdown. And this means even when the therapist means well or is trying to connect with the client, they might feel threatened. So sometimes providing a safe space for people who have experienced childhood emotional abuse might start from regulating their nervous system and not just talking through trauma. So, breathing with them, pacing the session, and letting the clients lead the session, and getting attuned to the client's feelings and emotions might help shift the client back into a state where they might be able to connect with the therapist. So, relational models like psychoanalytic therapy or compassion focused therapy, even person centered therapy, might emphasize relational depth as they might be more effective because they prioritize relational repair and building that foundational relational relationship over reducing symptoms or even finding solutions. This might help target the core belief that they might have, that other people will hurt them or they will ignore them or even neglect them. But there's not been lots of research on this field that could cause a unified approach that integrates both body, narrative, and even cultural factors. So, the study design was carried out using the Prisma guidelines, and four major databases were checked for papers. that spoke about emotional abuse, um, therapeutic relationship, any such them related to that, like emotional neglect, um, psychological abuse, relational death, working alliance, therapeutic relationship, such terms like that were used um, while searching these four databases, which were ProQuest, Psychaticals, Scopus, and Embase. And all studies included were between the years of 2000 and 2025. This was because I wanted to focus on studies that were not older than 2.5 decades, just so I can see if there's more consistency on datas between the years of 2000 and 2025, because datas between the years 1999 had more consistency of all datas of emotional abuse being cultural, and it couldn't be measured because different cultures saw emotional abuse differently. So datas from 2000 to 2025 had more definitions aligned more with that of my definition when I was writing my paper. And the paper was also papers included also were papers that were written in English language, included all ages, genders, or locations, and paper excluded were papers that spoke mainly of other forms of childhood abuse like financial abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse. These papers focused mostly on those forms of abuse rather than emotional abuse, and I included papers that spoke of emotional abuse, but not as the major form of abuse that was explored in the paper, more as papers that looked at childhood trauma in general. And these papers spoke about neglect and emotional abuse, which was why I included them in my study. Um, to access for risk bias and um, the for risk bias and to see how trustworthy and relevant the paper was to my study, I used the Critical Appraisal Skills Program, which is the CASP tool, which uses checklist and not a numerical rating to assess the risk bias in research. At the end of the search and the review of all the papers, I only reviewed 10 studies, which included qualitative, quantitative studies, and also conceptual studies. I also considered abuse type and developmental stage and therapeutic model as as a way of excluding papers too when I was filtering the papers. So during the review of the papers, I identified themes in the papers that were similar, like attachment, therapeutic alliance, trauma recovery, and even behavioral change. And I these themes were observed from seeing themes of mistrust, regulation, attunement, compassion, shame, and even rupture repair in the papers. And these words might reflect how emotional abuse shows up in therapy, not as a content to discuss in therapy, but as patterns that must be re experienced safely. I also found that secure attachment was linked to stronger therapeutic alliance, as clients who came into the sessions with unresolved or dismissive attachments might transfer their feelings onto the therapist basically. So what I saw was they might transfer how they basically maybe viewed their caregiver or their parent or whoever whoever was involved or whoever was responsible for them as the therapist, and this might um cause them to take longer getting deeper insights over their therapeutic sessions. And this supports the idea that trust building is a process and not a prerequisite, because these people might not have felt this sort of secure feeling or at this security in people before coming to their sessions. And I also found that another paper looked at neurobiological outcomes. So this paper found that psycho and analytical therapy, which is PAT, might lead to increased amygdala prefrontal connectivity by 34%, which might suggest deeper emotional regulation. And I also found that another paper by Blanning showed that polyvagal informed therapy added 26% more symptoms relief, more depressive symptoms relief. What I found basically was that these therapies that promote regulation before exploration work better for people who have experienced childhood emotional abuse. Another thing I found interesting when I was looking at the results of the papers was how cultural consideration makes a difference. I found that therapy isn't one size fits all, and different cultures might prefer therapy accessing therapy in different ways basically. So I found that in collectivist cultures, group therapies work better, whereas in individualistic cultures, they preferred one to one rapport. A paper which used Wellness Recovery Action Plan program found that in that paper, African American women found it took longer building trust in their therapist. But once they were able to build that trust and that therapeutic alliance was formed, their outcomes were significantly stronger. And this sparked a reflection that culture sometimes shapes how abuse is experienced by people and might also shape how healing journey begins. And this also shows that sometimes it takes longer, and extended alliance building sometimes is crucial for cultural sensitivity. So, the core findings that I found in the papers were therapeutic alliance is very important for effective child recovery for people who have experienced childhood emotional abuse, and secure attachment accelerates engagement and improves outcome. Unresolved and dismissive attachment, people who had unresolved and dismissive attachment found it difficult to engage in therapy, which sometimes made them leave therapy, which basically would not yield any outcome. I also found that therapists who tailor the therapeutic um the therapeutic journey basically to the cultural context of their clients add more successes with their clients. So, what does this mean for therapists? This means that sometimes people who have experienced childhood emotional abuse might benefit from extended alliance building phases rather than trying to um, solve, be more solution focused. It's best to focus more on building that alliance with them. Also, integrating polyvagal and narrative approaches in therapy, realizing that their their nervous system is on flight or fight mode, and sometimes they choose to fly because they find it difficult to build that connection and that trust with their therapist. So understanding this might help understand how to build that therapeutic relationship with their client. Um, Also, therapists understanding that longer term relational work, especially when the symptoms come from neglect and not from chaos, um, might benefit clients. And also, therapists might become co-regulators before they become interpreters or even problem solvers. So sometimes as therapists might have to help clients regulate how they feel, regulate their nervous system, and basically find a balance between them flying instead, staying in the sessions instead of flying, basically. Um, so to conclude this, I also looked into future research, which I found that future research might benefit from developing unified integrative models, and also looking into neurobiological studies and doing more neurobiological research, basically. And also in studies which included diverse samples and validated alliance measures actually found more success, but the studies were not a lot. So maybe more studies replicating this and seeing if that actually made a difference in our therapeutic alliance can be built. To conclude this, I found that the therapeutic alliance is the strongest tool that therapists have to help people who have experienced childhood emotional abuse heal. And I found that models like psychoanalytical person-centered therapies and compassion-focused therapies are promising, but integrating this therapy is needed. So basically, these therapies should not be done start as a single way or a single approach with clients. So integrating these therapies in the session might benefit um, clients. In essence, I found that therapy must restore, not just function, by building connection. Thank you so much. I'll be happy to take any questions if you have any. You can contact me by sending me an email on the email displayed on the screen. Thank you.